Hi. In the UK, we do everything a bit different. We drive on the left, our police are unarmed, we have no constitution, we have a weird monarchy, we choose to leave the EU and EASA when everyone else is desperate to join. We drink our beer at room temperature. Not better, not worse, just different. And that includes so much about the way we fly, particularly outside controlled airspace. So PPLIR Europe has made a series of 4 videos to help foreign visitors get the best out of the experience of flying here. These videos are directed at pilots who are intending to visit the UK from elsewhere, primarily Europe, and to help them understand our strange ways so they have a safe, enjoyable, and easy time in the UK. And we're well worth the visit. We have wonderful natural landscapes in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, and the hills and mountains of Wales, and the Lake District. And we have some of the most vibrant cities in the world in London, Manchester, and Glasgow, as well as some of the most beautiful, such as Bath, York, Cambridge, and Edinburgh. We have wonderful airfields with friendly and welcoming locals flying interesting aircraft, as well as some of the best aviation museums. So it's worth overcoming the small hurdles that our oddities provide. Even enjoy the quirkiness and the challenge as you broaden your horizons and experience. This first video is about our airspace. The second about air traffic services in and outside controlled airspace. The third about IFR in the UK. And the last one about getting permissions to make flights from customs and immigration, airfields, and the air traffic providers. The UK consists of Great Britain, that is the island made up of England, Scotland, and Wales. Its islands, like the Scottish Isles, Scilly Isles, Anglesey and the Isle of Wight, and Northern Ireland. It does not include the Channel Islands, the Isle of Man, or the Republic of Ireland. They have their own authorities and rules, which I'll not be covering. Let's look at a scenario flying from Belgium to Gloucestershire and talk about the airspace you'll need to consider on the way. The airspace classifications we use, A to G, are the same as everywhere else, though, like everywhere else, there are always slightly different interpretations, which I'll talk about. Most of our airspace is classed A, D, and G. We make much less use of E and C than the rest of Europe. But, as I'll be discussing a bit later, within Class G there are various constructs you need to understand. You should be aware that almost all controlled airspace in the UK is protected by a radar and software system called Controlled Airspace Infringement Tool, or CAIT. CAIT means that no infringement, however small and however brief, will go unnoticed, and every infringement is followed up with regulatory action from the Civil Aviation Authority. The days of individual controllers choosing to shrug their shoulders and turn a blind eye are long gone. You need to be very alert. Also, airspace is said to start at exactly its base, or top. So if the base of controlled airspace is 2,500 feet and you fly at 2,500 feet, the CAIT alarm will go off and a process will start. Now, you may get away with it from a legalistic point of view. In the very unlikely event that it came to court, magistrates may well decide that there's sufficient doubt to acquit, but that's absolutely not the point. The point is that you'll be engaged in paperwork and discussions which are much better avoided, which is why most people here fly at least 100 feet, but very often 200 feet below the base of controlled airspace. We're also asked to remain at least 2 nautical miles laterally, but that can cause its own problems of driving aircraft too close together. And while we're talking about altimetry, we should discuss the various standards that are used in the UK. Commercial air transport uses QNH below the transition level and standard barometric setting 1013 hectopascals above the transition altitude, just like the rest of Europe. But outside controlled airspace, we have regional pressure settings, RPS, which are designed to keep you terrain safe by giving you the lowest QNH expected in the region you're flying. You'll hear these referred to by regional names, such as the Barnsley pressure setting or the Cotswold pressure setting. The problem with using the RPS is unless you happen to be at the low pressure point of the setting region, your altimeter will always underread compared to the local QNH. This creates the risk of flying into controlled airspace above you, which will be based on the QNH of the parent aerodrome. My advice to you would be never to use the RPS. You can always request a local QNH, listen to the ATIS of nearby airfields, or listen out for other aircraft being given clearances which include the QNH. Many small airfields and their users use QFE for circuit and for landing, which reads 0 on the ground. That's your choice, but if you come from a system which doesn't use QFE, my advice would be to stick to QNH. You can always ask for it when you're given QFE. Most of the military also uses QFE, and I'll be talking about that in a minute. So, back to our scenario. The first airspace you encounter is Class A, initially from flight level 75 upwards, but the base lowers as we get closer to the London airports. We see it descend to flight level 65 and then to altitude 5,500 feet. The transition altitude in the UK is generally 3,000 feet, but in most airspace within or beneath controlled airspace, it's 6,000 or 5,000 feet. To make this a little bit more complicated, there are places where it reverts to 3,000 feet when the controlled airspace is closed. I wouldn't worry too much about this. The best way of knowing is to look at how the base or top of controlled airspace you're going past is defined and use that to avoid the airspace. If you're inside controlled airspace, the controller will clear you to a level or altitude and you can take your lead from that. The next thing we encounter is some Class D airspace. This particular piece of airspace is controlled by Southend. As we all know, both types of traffic, VFR and IFR, are permitted in Class D. But in the UK, you must get an explicit clearance to enter from the authority which controls the airspace. If you've not heard the words
Delta Alpha Bravo Sierra Delta is cleared to enter Southend airspace
before you reach the boundary, you must avoid it. You cannot get a clearance from the Regional Flight Information Service, or FIS, as you can in many European countries. Do not be put off by the first words they say to you, which will be,
remain outside controlled airspace.
That is just intended to remind you that you need a clearance and you haven't yet got one. It will likely be replaced by a clearance shortly afterwards. Occasionally, requests will be denied, so have an alternative routing in mind as well. A typical conversation would be,
Southend Radar, November 111 Alpha Bravo, request traffic service and zone transit.
November 1 Alpha Bravo, Southend Radar, pass your message.
November 1 Alpha Bravo, Piper Arrow, en route to Gloucester, overhead Faversheim, altitude 2,000 feet, QNH 1020, request traffic service and VFR transit, Sheerness to Basildon.
November 1 Alpha Bravo, remain outside controlled airspace, squawk 5053.
Squawk 5053, remain outside, November 1 Alpha Bravo.
November 1 Alpha Bravo, identified 2 miles north of Faversham, traffic service. You are clear to enter Southend airspace VFR, not above 2,400 feet on Southend QNH 1020, routing Sheerness docks to Basildon.
Traffic service. Clear to cross VFR Sheerness to Basildon, not above 2,400 on 1020, November 1 Alpha Bravo.
Then, as you enter controlled airspace,
November 1 Alpha Bravo, entering controlled airspace, radar control.
Radar control, November 1 Alpha Bravo.
and as you leave controlled airspace,
November 1 Alpha Bravo, traffic service on leaving controlled airspace, report leaving the frequency.
Traffic service, Wilco, November 1 Alpha Bravo.
I'll be explaining the terms basic traffic and radar control in the next video. Also, if you filed a flight plan which takes you through or near a Class D zone, they will not automatically receive it. If you go to the trouble of addressing your flight plan to the zone, usually the ICAO code of the airfield followed by Zulu Tango Zulu X-ray, it may or may not be turned into a strip for the controller, but anyway does not confer any rights or permissions. You still need to call for transit. The clearance will specify a squawk and whether it's VFR or IFR, and you must fly according to those rules. Generally, a VFR clearance will be not above an altitude, and an IFR clearance will be at an altitude or level. Although Class D controllers should just give VFR aircraft traffic information and leave them to avoid the traffic, in practice they'll very often permit them to pass a waypoint or VRP only if they've seen the traffic, and then will be told to fly behind them. It's also quite common to be given routings, such as crossing a runway threshold or remaining to the east of a town or other visible object, or an orbit. In theory, these rules apply to all Class D zones, but there are also some special cases. Firstly, London City Airport. As almost the whole zone covers central London, and the low-flying rules say that you must be able to land clear of built-up areas in the event of an engine failure, and because parks and rivers are considered built-up areas, London City Zone is pretty much limited to multi-engined aircraft. There are exceptions for single-engined helicopters who can follow routes which are deemed safe for auto-rotation. Central London also has prohibited zones up to 1,400 feet to protect government buildings, etc. It's not uncommon to get a clearance not above 1,500 feet, which means you have to be very accurate about your altitude keeping. Secondly, Heathrow. Access to transiting traffic is very limited. A dedicated frequency called Heathrow Radar is available for low-level VFR transits. There is a route between Burnham and Ascot, which is fun to fly as it's low over the ground, and you can sometimes cut other corners, for example via Brent Reservoir, but my advice would be to get a local to fly with you before you try it alone. The other thing about Heathrow is that there are 3 airfields, Fair Oaks, White Waltham and Denham, all of which you may well want to visit, which are embedded in the zone. They're perfectly easy to use, but each of them has their own local rules, and I would recommend reading about them and phoning them before visiting for the first time. They do result in a lot of infringements of the Heathrow zone and are very conscious of noise abatement for neighbours, so it's important to stick to their procedures if you don't want to fill in loads of forms and then get a nasty letter or worse. Another interesting Class D zone is Manchester. It's notoriously difficult to get a crossing, at least partially because there's poor communication between the tower controller, who's launching transport jets, and the zone controller, who doesn't know when they're coming. And accordingly, the zone is permanently sterilised just in case some traffic takes off. This makes it pretty pointless requesting a crossing, as you're likely to be pushed down below 1,200 feet and then pushed to one side into Liverpool airspace. There is a low-level corridor allowing free north-south transit, but again there are strict rules about its use, with an altitude limit of 1,300 feet, a speed limit of 140 knots, and a compulsory squawk and listening frequency. It's easy enough to use if you follow the rules, but keep a very careful eye out for other traffic. It can get quite busy. So that's how Class D works in the UK. Generally not a problem to cross in VFR or IFR, but you must get an explicit spoken clearance, including the words, "is cleared to enter." If you're not planning to enter Class D, but will be passing close by, you can choose to squawk the frequency monitoring code, or listening squawk as it's colloquially called, and listen to the associated frequency. This means that the zone controller can contact you quickly if you penetrate the zone accidentally, or even warn you if they think you're at risk of doing so. You shouldn't make any calls on this frequency. You just listen out in case they want to talk to you. These squawks and frequencies can be found in the en route 680 section of the AIP, but more conveniently are in SkyDemon, as well as on maps published by UK authorities. The next thing we encounter on this route is an air traffic zone, or ATZ. Most licensed or certificated aerodromes have an ATZ, but be aware, many GA aerodromes outside controlled airspace do not have a formal ATZ, despite being very busy. So pass with caution and consider a radio call to the aerodrome. ATZs are a form of designated airspace, 4 or 5 nautical miles in diameter, depending on the runway length of the airfield, and they stretch up to a height of 2,000 feet above the airfield. So you'll see slightly odd altitudes for their tops. It's not uncommon for their tops to penetrate controlled airspace above, so you can't fly over them without a clearance. ATZs are the same class of airspace as that in which they sit. But if they're in Class D airspace, they don't really mean very much, as either they're controlled by the same authority as the Class D zone, or there are special rules, such as those that apply to Denham, Fair Oaks and White Waltham, which remove most of the Class D restrictions. So it's the ones in Class G airspace which we need to focus on. In all cases, you have duties before you enter ATZs. These rules vary depending on the nature of the services offered by the airfield. The UK has some aerodromes outside controlled airspace, such as Shoreham or Exeter, that are still controlled. Instructions from ATC at these aerodromes are advisory before entering the ATZ, but you must not enter the ATZ without permission, and once inside, all instructions are mandatory. I say permission because you don't get the explicit formal clearance you do for Class D, but you do need to be told to join downwind or whatever the instruction may be. If the airfield has an aerodrome flight information service, so their call sign is information, then you must get the traffic and weather information you need to remain safe. An information service cannot control you in the air, but may well make suggestions about how you join and fit into the circuit. This is typically done by asking you to report at a specific point, for example, report overhead. You can elect to make a different type of join if you want and advise the Flight Information Service Officer, the FISO. If there is only an air-ground service, a call sign of radio, you still need to get information as best you can. But as they are not obliged to answer your calls, that may just be by listening to other aircraft and keeping your eyes out. For example, if there are others in the circuit, they'll announce what runway they're on downwind and final for, and you can use that information to plan your own circuit. You are supposed to announce on the radio as you enter and leave an ATZ, but don't be too concerned about the precise timing of this call. Announce your joining intentions once on the aerodrome frequency, and then make standard position calls in the circuit. You may well be asked to
join overhead, join dead side,
or
report dead side.
So you should have an idea what these expressions mean. So I must tell you about the overhead join. This is the standard way to join a circuit in the UK at uncontrolled airfields and even some ATC airfields. At uncontrolled airfields, it can't be enforced as no one has control over you in the air. But if you don't do it at places where it's expected, you might get a talking to in the clubhouse when you arrive. We talk about the side of the runway with the circuit as being the live side and the other side as the dead side. If you arrive from the live side, you should be at 2,000 feet above the airfield elevation and cross the landing runway threshold. You then descend on the dead side to circuit altitude, which is normally 1,000 feet above the airfield elevation, in a 180-degree turn in the direction of the circuit, cross the other threshold at circuit altitude and follow the circuit. If you're arriving from the dead side, some people would argue that you should always fly to the overhead at 2,000 feet, turn in the direction of the circuit to be over the landing threshold at 2,000 feet, and then descend on the dead side in the same way. But many people, if the circuit is quiet, will simply descend on the dead side to cross the far end threshold at 1,000 feet, then join the circuit. This should be announced as a dead side or crosswind join on the radio. If the circuit is empty or very quiet, you can always ask on the radio if there's any problem with a downwind or straight in join, or even on base leg from the wrong side. But if you do that into a busy circuit, you're likely to get a fairly frosty reception from your fellow pilots. Of course, if you're VFR and the cloud base prevents a full overhead join, you have to join directly into the circuit. I fly a fast, heavy, high inertia aircraft, and it can sometimes be quite difficult to fit into a slow circuit without inconvenience or risk to others. So I sometimes just do what I have to do while minimize annoyance to other pilots as much as I can, and, if necessary, explain the art of the possible on the ground. One other little oddity about ATZs is that civilian ATZs only exist when the airfield is open, but ATZs of most military airfields are permanently active and must not be entered when the airfield is closed. Now we're talking about the ATZs of military airfields, I need to mention the next bit of airspace on our route, the Military Air Traffic Zone, or MATS. The MATS is bigger than the ATZ, mostly being 10 nautical miles diameter and 3,000 feet above the airfield, normally with a number of panhandles, or stubs as they're called, around the approach paths, extending a further 5 nautical miles and from 1,000 to 3,000 feet above the airfield. Now, MATSs have a very strange status. Legally, a civilian aircraft can just ignore their existence. The authorities use terms like requested, advised, and recommended, and the military controller cannot grant or deny a clearance to enter them. However, civilian pilots are taught to respect them as controlled airspace, and my recommendation is that you do the same. MATS controllers often ask you to set QFE. Once outside the MATS, the controller will normally give you the regional pressure setting. But remember instead to set QNH, or you may infringe the next bit of airspace vertically. When you're given approval to cross a MATS, that usually does not include the ATZ. Generally, I would recommend staying above or to one side of the ATZ, but if you really want and need to cross it, you do need a clearance from ATC. Most MATSs are closed evenings and weekends. If you want to cross one, make a couple of calls to the frequency given on the chart or on your app, and if you get no answer, just go through avoiding the ATZ. Now, let's go back to our route. On the assumption that you've decided to heed my warnings about London City and Heathrow zones, you've probably decided to get a clearance across the Southend zone, which is unlikely to be a problem VFR or IFR, and to pass north of London. Just north of the Stapleford ATZ, which rises very nearly to the base of Class A airspace, there is a transponder mandatory zone, or TMZ. You can enter it at will, but you must have a working MODES transponder. There are also radio mandatory zones, or RMZ. Actually, as far as I know, there are very few RMZs. Two well-known ones are one around Harden, just south of Liverpool, and the other between Land's End and the Isles of Scilly, a great place in the UK to visit. The easiest way to enter the Harden RMZ is to squawk the frequency monitoring code and listen on the associated frequency. Otherwise, if you don't have a working transponder, you must call them first. For Land's End, you must call the frequency before entry. No clearance is required, but you do need to be in contact. Right, let's move on to prohibited, restricted, and danger airspace. The easiest way to deal with them is to use an up-to-date moving map, and by up-to-date, I mean just before you take off. I can only speak for SkyDemon, which always seems to get it right and give you the information you need. I've heard reports of other systems not always being right, but I don't want to get into any religious wars. In SkyDemon, inactive danger areas, whether because of opening hours or NOTAMs, are greyed out and you can safely fly through. This is enhanced by Weekend View, which greys out all weekday-only danger areas. Unfortunately, it still produces an airspace warning for an inactive danger area, which is a bit irritating. There are only two small low-level prohibited areas, one to the northwest of Glasgow, the other on the north coast of Scotland. Don't go in them, what more can I say? There are far more danger and restricted areas, and to be honest, I don't really think there's much practical difference between them in the UK. Many danger areas have laws against entry, so how are they not restricted areas? But anyway, the CAA will follow up any detected danger area penetration, even if there's no law banning it, as they see it as an educational opportunity. So you're going to have to go through a process, even if they don't have the power to prosecute. So I'd strongly suggest that if a danger area is active, just don't go through it. Treat it just like a restricted area. Some danger and restricted areas are permanent. Some are only active at certain times, generally the working day, and many are only activated by NOTAM. There are even restricted areas to protect the royal palaces when the family are in residence, so for maybe a couple of months a year. There are quite a few restricted areas which only apply to helicopters or drones. For example, most prisons have a restricted area which aeroplanes can go through, but not helicopters for obvious reasons. Though I often wonder whether a pilot willing to take the risk of flying drugs in or escaping prisoners out of prison is going to be bothered by a letter of admonishment from the CAA. Even if danger areas are marked or NOTAMed as active, many of them will have danger area crossing service. This is a frequency you can call and ask for approval to cross. If they're not actively firing their guns or don't have fighter jets dropping bombs at the time you call, they'll let you through. They do like to be given an entry time and an exit time. So you would say,
request clearance through Delta 510B from 10:25 until 10:40.
And they will compare that with their schedule. There's another service called Danger Area Activity Information Service, phonetically pronounced DAIS, which is provided for many danger areas. They can't let you through, but they do know whether they're active or inactive. Unfortunately, SkyDemon doesn't differentiate between DACs and DAIS. It just gives a frequency, but it's a fair guess that if the frequency is for London or Scottish information, then it's only a DAIS. But if it has the same name or a similar name to the danger areas, so for example, Spadeadam has a station called Spadeadam, or if it ends with range, so Donnanook has a station called Donnanook Range, or military, such as Plymouth Mill, then that will be a DAX. It's always worth trying. The worst they can say is no, and if they say yes, it can save a lot of time and fuel. Like other countries, we also have temporary restricted areas called RATs. These are either planned sometime ahead, like for Red Arrows displays or Wimbledon tennis, or sometimes very short notice in response to an unexpected emergency like a train crash. They also appear on SkyDemon, but obviously the emergency ones will only be added as they happen, which is why I said you should connect your SkyDemon to the internet as late as possible before takeoff. Having said that, if there's a sudden emergency, whoever you're talking to will warn you and probably suggest a route like,
To avoid, I suggest you fly south of Mansfield.
You'll also see on the charts mention of high-intensity radio transmission areas. These are generally okay to fly through, but not to loiter, so they're more addressed to hovering helicopters and aerobatics aircraft than touring aircraft. Laser sights might produce a blinding light, but there's no obligation to stay out of them. Gas venting could produce turbulence and disruption to turbine engines, up to you really. Charts and moving maps are also marked with warnings of glider winch launch sites. Cable launching of gliders takes place throughout the UK, and conflict with other traffic is a common safety issue, so remain clear either laterally or vertically. Obviously, microlighting, parachute and hang gliding sites should also be avoided, just as I'm sure they are in your home country. Finally, noise-sensitive areas and routes. Local residents are getting more and more vociferous and making life difficult for airfields and airports alike. If we want to keep those facilities open, it really helps to avoid areas of greater sensitivity and to follow preferred routes, which again are usually shown on SkyDemon. Okay, that's it for airspace. If you need any more information, there are a couple of very helpful resources to look at. The CAA's Skyway Code is an excellent, simple but comprehensive document which goes into much more detail than I can here, and the Airspace and Safety Initiative has many helpful articles both about flying in the UK in general and also highlighting particular issues and hotspots. Links to both can be found below. The next video is going to be about air traffic services in the airspace I've just described. The link is below. See you there.